The courtroom in Redemption, Texas smelled like sawdust, tobacco smoke, and something Helen Carver could only describe as reckoning. It was the spring of 1882, and the air inside Judge Harlan Beaumont's makeshift courthouse, really just the back half of the old Cattlemen's Union Hall, was thick with the kind of tension that precedes a verdict or a gunshot, and sometimes both. Helen stood at the plaintiff's table, her dark auburn hair pinned back beneath a modest hat, her green eyes fixed on the man sitting across the aisle from her, with the confidence of someone who had never once considered losing. David Sheridan, the infamous broken spur outlaw. The man who had stolen 340 acres of the most fertile ranchland in Crockett County right out from under her, using a fraudulent bill of sale, a crooked land agent, and the arrogance of a man who had never met a woman he could not dismiss. He was leaning back in his chair with his arms folded across his chest, watching her with those storm-gray eyes that crinkled slightly at the corners when he was amused. He was amused right now. She could see it in the lazy tilt of his jaw, in the way his lips curved just faintly to the right. He thought she had nothing. He thought she was bluffing. His attorney, a slick-haired man named Gerald Finch who had come all the way down from San Antonio, was halfway through a speech about the legitimacy of the sale when Helen Carver reached into the leather satchel at her feet, withdrew a single folded document, and placed it flat on the table in front of her. Judge Beaumont peered over his spectacles. "Miss Carver, do you have something to present to this court?" "I do, Your Honor," Helen said, and her voice was steady as river stone. "I have the original signed deed to the Carver Ranch, registered in the Crockett County Land Office on March the 4th, 1871, bearing the signature of my father, Thomas Edwin Carver, the Crockett County Clerk, and 2 witnesses who are still living and present in this room today." She unfolded it. The room went perfectly still. Gerald Finch stopped speaking mid-sentence. "And David Sheridan, who had ridden through 3 state lines with a bounty on his name, who had faced down armed men in 4 different counties, who had never once flinched in the face of danger, sat forward in his chair so fast it scraped against the floorboards, and stared at that document with an expression Helen had never seen on his face before. Pure, unguarded shock. She held his gaze across the aisle, and for the first time since this nightmare had begun 6 weeks ago, she allowed herself the faintest ghost of a smile. She had him. But to understand how Helen Carver came to be standing in that courtroom with a deed that everyone, including David Sheridan, believed had been destroyed in a fire 7 years prior, you had to go back to the beginning. You had to go back to the night a rider came through the darkness with bad news, and a woman who was not supposed to be capable of saving herself proved every single soul in Crockett County wrong. It began 6 weeks before that courtroom, on a cold Thursday evening in late March of 1882. Helen Carver was in the barn at the back of the ranch property. She had managed alone for the past 4 years, and she was entirely absorbed in something that would have startled most people who thought they knew what a rancher's daughter did with her evenings. She was surveying. She had laid out a detailed topographical sketch of the entire northeastern quarter of the property on a clean sheet of drafting paper, and she was cross-referencing it against a copy of the original land plat she kept rolled inside a tin cylinder behind the loose third board of the barn's south wall. Helen Carver was a surveyor, not an amateur one, not a woman playing at a man's profession. She had learned the trade from her father, who had been one of the finest land surveyors in the Western Territories before his death, and she had spent 12 years sharpening that skill into something that was, by any honest measure, exceptional. She could read a plat like most people read a letter, could calculate acreage in her head faster than most men could with a pencil, and she understood the legal language of land titles and deed descriptions the way a lawyer understood statutes. It was a skill that had always seemed impractical and excessive to the men around her, right up until the moment it became the only thing standing between her and losing everything. The barn door opened with a bang, and her ranch hand, an older Mexican man named Ernesto Vidal who had worked the Carver land since before Helen was born, came stumbling in with his hat in both hands and alarm written across every line of his weathered face. "Miss Helen," he said, catching his breath, "you need to come to the house. There is a man. He came from the county office in town." Helen rolled her drafting paper carefully and slid it back into the tin. "What man?" "His name is Horton. He is with the land office, he says." Ernesto stopped, pressed his lips together. "He says the ranch has been sold." Helen put the tin back behind the board, turned to face Ernesto, and said very calmly, "Say that again." "He says the ranch has been sold, Miss Helen, to a man named Sheridan, David Sheridan. He says the deed transfer was filed yesterday morning and it is legal." The cold March air seemed to sharpen around her. Helen took a breath, picked up her lantern from the hook by the stall, and walked out of the barn toward the house without saying another word, because she did not trust what she might say if she opened her mouth right then. The man from the land office was named Clement Horton, and he was deeply uncomfortable, which suggested to Helen that he was not entirely without a conscience. He sat at her kitchen table with his hat balanced on his knee, and a folded document that he slid across the table toward her with the careful movements of a man who expects the person on the other side to either weep or throw something. Helen did neither. She picked up the document and read every word of it. It was a bill of sale. It purported to be signed by her father, Thomas Edwin Carver, transferring the 340 acres of the Carver ranch to one Raymond Hollies of San Antonio, who had subsequently sold the property to David Sheridan for the sum of $4,000. The signature on the bill of sale was a remarkable forgery. She had to give someone credit for it. But it was a forgery nonetheless, because Thomas Edwin Carver had been dead since the winter of 1878, and this document was dated November of 1879. "Mr. Horton," Helen said, setting the document back on the table with the measured calm of someone who has just decided upon a course of action and intends to follow it through. "My father died of pneumonia on December the 2nd, 1878. This document is dated 11 months after his death. You have filed a fraudulent transfer." Clement Horton turned the color of old ash. "Miss Carver, the signatures were notarized and the documentation appeared. Where is the original deed to this property?" she asked. He opened his mouth, closed it. The deed on record at the county office was, "There was a fire last autumn." Some of the older records were, "I know about the fire," Helen said, "but I also know that the deed to this property was not the only copy in existence. My father was a surveyor, Mr. Horton. He was meticulous about his records. Whoever arranged this transaction believed that fire eliminated the only evidence that would expose this fraud. They were wrong." She watched his face go through several things at once, relief and terror in about equal measure, and she thanked him for coming, showed him to the door, and then stood on her porch in the cold March dark for a long moment, looking out at the land her father had broken his back to build, the land she had kept running through drought and cattle sickness and the loneliness of managing it alone, and she felt something harden in her chest that was not grief and not fear. It was resolve. She turned around, went back inside, and started making a list of everything she needed. David Sheridan arrived on the property the following morning. Helen heard the horses before she saw them, 3 riders coming up the long track from the southern gate, and she knew immediately that the man in front was Sheridan before she could make out his face, because of the way he rode. There was a particular quality to it, unhurried and utterly certain, that set him apart from the 2 men flanking him. He sat his black horse like a man who was accustomed to arriving places and finding them already his. She was standing on the porch when they pulled up, and she did not move. David Sheridan was not what she had expected, which unsettled her more than she wanted to admit. She had expected someone flashier, someone who wore his reputation on the outside the way outlaw men often did, all silver conchos and elaborate leather and practiced menace. What she got instead was a man who looked like he had been built by the land itself. He was broad across the shoulders in a way that came from actual labor rather than posture, with dark hair that curled slightly at the collar of his coat and a jaw that had clearly had a fist or two against it over the years. His eyes were that particular gray that changes shade with the light, and when he looked at her from under the brim of his hat, it was with a directness that would have been unsettling in anyone. In him it was something else entirely, something she did not have a word for yet and did not particularly want to find one. "You must be Helen Carver," he said. His voice was a low, unhurried baritone that matched his writing. "I am," she said, "and this is still my property. I will ask you to take your men and go back the way you came." One of the men flanking him, a thick-set rider with a red beard, made a sound that was almost a laugh. David Sheridan silenced it with a sideways glance that required no words. "Miss Carver," he said, returning his gaze to her with something in it that she could not read, "I have a legal deed of transfer registered with the Crockett County Land Office. The property title is in my name as of 2 days ago. I have no wish to make this difficult." "Then do not," she said, "because if you stay on this property you will be the one making it difficult. I intend to contest this transfer in court, and I intend to win. The deed you hold is based on a fraudulent bill of sale. My father was dead before that sale was ever executed." Something shifted in his expression. It was subtle, barely a flicker, but it was there. He had not expected her to say that. He had expected either capitulation or tears or demands for money, the usual responses of a woman in her position, and the fact that she had opened with a legal argument visibly recalibrated something behind those gray eyes. "That's a serious accusation," he said. "It is a serious fact," Helen replied. "One that I can prove." He studied her for a moment that stretched longer than was comfortable, and she held his gaze without blinking, because she had grown up reading survey plats and arguing property lines with stubborn county clerks, and she was not about to be unnerved by a man on a horse, no matter how the morning light caught the angles of his face. "I give you 30 days, he said finally. She blinked, just once. "I beg your pardon. 30 days, he repeated. "Before I bring workers in to take possession. That gives you time to make whatever arrangements you need to make." He said it in a tone that suggested this was generosity, and perhaps by the standards of the world he moved in, it was. "I do not need 30 days to make arrangements," Helen said. "I need 30 days to assemble my evidence and file a proper legal challenge, which I intend to do regardless of whether you grant me the time or not." He looked at her again with that unreadable expression, then touched 2 fingers to the brim of his hat in something that was not quite mockery and not quite respect, a gesture suspended somewhere in the uncertain territory between the two. "30 days, Miss Carver," he said, and he turned his horse and rode back down the track, his 2 men following. Helen stood on the porch until they were through the gate and out of sight, and then she let out a breath she had apparently been holding since he arrived, went inside, and sat down at her father's desk. She had 30 days, possibly less if Sheridan changed his mind, and she had no particular reason to believe he was a man who kept his word. She had a forged bill of sale, a fraudulent transfer, a county land office that had been complicit either through corruption or incompetence, and a deed that the entire world believed had burned in the courthouse fire of 1881. But the entire world was wrong. Thomas Carver had been, as Helen told Clement Horton, a meticulous man. He had made 3 copies of the original deed when the ranch was established in 1871. One had gone to the county office. One he had kept in his own files, which had burned along with his study during a lightning fire in 1877. And the third he had given to a man named Archibald Holt, a retired circuit court judge who had been his closest friend and legal advisor, with instructions that it be kept in Holt's personal strongbox against the day it might be needed. The day had come. Archibald Holt was 81 years old, half-blind, and living in a small house on the eastern edge of the town of Redemption, Texas, which was 12 miles from the Carver Ranch. He was also one of the most legally formidable minds Helen had ever encountered, retired or otherwise, and when she rode into Redemption the following morning and knocked on his door at 7 o'clock, he opened it in his nightshirt, took one look at her face and said, "Sit down and tell me everything." She did. When she finished, Archibald Holt was quiet for a long moment. Then he pushed himself up from his chair with the careful movements of a man whose joints had strong opinions about sudden movement, shuffled to the iron strongbox in the corner of his study, and withdrew a sealed envelope that bore her father's handwriting on the front. "Your father told me," Holt said, setting the envelope on the desk between them, "that if something happened to him and someone came to take this land from you, I was to give you this and trust your judgment entirely. He believed in your judgment, Helen, more than he ever told you, I expect." Helen looked at the envelope with her father's careful handwriting and felt something ache in her chest that she could not afford to feel right now, so she tucked it away behind the resolve and focused on what came next. The envelope contained the original deed, signed and witnessed and utterly authentic, and it also contained something she had not expected. A letter her father had written, addressed to her, sometime in the year before his death. In it, he laid out in meticulous detail his concerns about a man named Raymond Hollis, a land speculator out of San Antonio who had been quietly pressuring small ranchers in Crockett County to sell, using legal threats and forged documents and the general corruption of certain county officials. Thomas Carver had been building a case against Hollis at the time of his death. He had listed witnesses, documented transactions, and recorded everything with the methodical thoroughness of a man who understood that evidence was the only reliable weapon against injustice. He had, in other words, assembled nearly everything Helen needed to not just defend her own property, but to expose the entire fraudulent enterprise that had placed it in David Sheridan's hands. This was more than she had hoped for. This was a gift from a dead man who had loved his daughter enough to build her a fortress before he knew she would need one. She spent the next 4 days at Archibald Holt's kitchen table, organizing her father's documents, drafting her legal challenge, and sending letters to the 2 witnesses named on the original deed, both of whom were still living in Crockett County. One was a retired carpenter named Silas Webb who ran a small furniture shop in Redemption, and the other was a woman named Clara Morrison who had been the Carver family's nearest neighbor for 20 years. Both of them wrote back within 3 days. Both of them said yes. In the meantime, Redemption was talking. Small towns in 1882 Texas operated on a combination of cattle prices, weather, and other people's troubles, and the situation at the Carver Ranch had provided the third element in abundance. Helen heard the whispers when she went into town for supplies, sympathy from some, skepticism from others, and the kind of head-shaking that suggested most people believed that whatever she was planning, it would not amount to much against a man like David Sheridan. She ignored it all and kept working. It was on the 5th day, while she was riding back from town, that David Sheridan appeared at her gate again. Alone this time, which surprised her. He was leaning against the gatepost with his horse tied to the fence and his hat pushed back on his head, and he straightened when he saw her coming. Helen pulled her mare up short and looked at him. "You have a habit of appearing on my property without invitation," she said. "I have legal title to this property," he said, but there was something in his voice that was different from before. Less certainty, maybe, or a different kind of certainty. "You have a fraudulent title," she said. "There is a distinction." She dismounted, led her horse through the gate, and he stepped aside to let her pass. She had not asked him to leave, which was not an invitation exactly, but he seemed to interpret it as one, because he fell into step beside her. "Miss Carver," he said, after they had walked a few steps in a silence that was not quite comfortable and not quite hostile, "I am going to ask you something directly, and I would appreciate a direct answer." "I generally prefer direct questions to indirect ones," she said. "Go ahead." Did you actually find evidence of fraud, or are you mounting a challenge to buy time? She stopped walking and looked at him. He was watching her with those gray eyes that gave nothing away, and she decided in that moment that the most strategically sound course of action was also the most personally satisfying one. I found the original deed to this property, she said. Signed, witnessed, and notarized in 1871. I found documentation proving my father was deceased before the bill of sale you hold was executed. I have 2 living witnesses to the original deed who will testify in court. And I have evidence that Raymond Hollies, whose name appears on your chain of title, has been engaged in a pattern of fraudulent land transfers in this county for at least 5 years. She watched his face as she said it. She watched the moment the amusement died in his eyes and something else replaced it, something she could not fully categorize. It was not fear. It was not quite guilt. It was something that looked almost like a man recalculating a situation he had believed fully resolved. "Where did you find the original deed?" he asked. "That is not information I owe you," she said, and resumed walking toward the house. He followed. He seemed to do that without entirely deciding to, which she noticed. "Hollies told me the title was clean," he said. "I am certain he did," Helen said. "Men like Raymond Hollies generally do. How much did you pay for this property?" She asked because the number was relevant to understanding how deeply Hollies had embedded the fraud. $4,000, Sheridan said. "And what is it worth?" A pause. "More than that." "Significantly more," she agreed. "Which means Hollies gave you a favorable price to ensure the sale moved quickly and without scrutiny. You were not just a victim of the fraud, Mr. Sheridan. You were an incentive he offered himself." He stopped walking. She had reached the porch steps and turned to look at him, standing a few feet away in the afternoon light with his thumbs hooked in his belt, and an expression on his face that she found considerably more interesting than his earlier certainty. "You are either the most capable woman I have ever met," he said slowly, "or the most dangerous. Those are not mutually exclusive," she said. "And frankly, in my experience, they are almost always the same thing." Something crossed his face that was very nearly a smile. "No," he said, "I suppose they are not." She looked at him for a moment longer than she intended, then went inside and closed the door. She stood in the front hall for a moment, listening to the sound of his horse moving away down the track, and permitted herself to acknowledge, quietly and without much comfort, that David Sheridan was more complicated than she had been prepared for him to be. She had expected a simple villain. She had prepared for a simple villain. A man who had knowingly stolen her land, who was corrupt and greedy and easy to despise. What she had instead was a man who appeared, and she was maintaining considerable skepticism about this, to have been deceived himself. Not that it changed anything. The land was still hers, and she still intended to prove it, but it made the shape of the thing more complicated, and Helen Carver had always had a weakness for complicated things. She pushed the thought aside and went back to work. The next 2 weeks were the most intensively occupied of Helen's life. She rode to Redemption and back 3 times to meet with Archibald Holt, who was officially advising her on the legal strategy despite being retired, because he knew the district court better than anyone, and because he had told her flatly that if she tried to navigate this alone, he would haunt her for it from the grave. She interviewed Silas Webb and Clara Morrison separately to ensure their testimonies would be consistent and detailed. She reviewed her father's documentation twice, then a third time, organizing it into an argument so precise and sequenced that Archibald Holt said it was the clearest legal brief he had read in 30 years of practicing. She also had a visit from Raymond Hollies. She had not expected that. It was on the 12th day, and he arrived with a hired man and a great deal of false warmth, presenting himself as a San Antonio businessman who had heard there might be some confusion about a recent land transaction, and was very eager to clear it all up. He was a slender, well-dressed man of about 50, with a salesman's smile and eyes that were always calculating something. Helen offered him coffee, sat across from him at the kitchen table, and listened to him explain very carefully, very smoothly, that there had been a clerical error in the original bill of sale, that he was prepared to offer her a generous settlement in lieu of the formal legal process, which would be costly and difficult for a woman in her position, and that he was certain they could resolve this privately in a way that was fair to all parties. She let him finish. She poured herself more coffee. She looked at him. "Mr. Hollis," she said pleasantly, "I believe you have just attempted to bribe me. And I want you to know that I have made a note of the date, your offer amount, and the exact words you used, because this conversation is going to be very useful when the question of your other fraudulent transactions in this county comes before the court." The salesman's smile became something thinner and less pleasant. "Miss Carver, I strongly advise you to consult your own attorney," Helen said, with complete serenity. "And perhaps consider whether Mr. Sheridan is going to be quite as understanding when he learns the full details of what you sold him." Hollis left without finishing his coffee. Helen sat at the table for a moment after he was gone, very still, and then realized her hands were shaking slightly. Not from fear, she decided. From the particular kind of adrenaline that comes from doing exactly the right thing in exactly the right way and knowing it. She did not see David Sheridan again until the week before the hearing. He appeared at her gate on a Wednesday evening, again alone, and this time she was in the yard rather than the barn, working by lantern light on a final correction to the property boundary sketch she intended to use as a visual exhibit in court. She was on one knee in the dirt with a measuring tool and a compass, and she heard his horse on the track and looked up but did not stand. He dismounted, tied his horse, and walked over to where she was working. He looked down at the sketch on the ground, a large, meticulously detailed topographical drawing of the property with boundary measurements marked at every corner and along every line, annotated with legal descriptions that matched the deed language precisely. He was quiet for a long moment. "Did you draw this?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "It is a land survey," he said, "not quite a question." "I am a surveyor," she said, going back to her measurement. "My father trained me from the time I was old enough to hold a transit level. I have been surveying this property my entire life. I could describe every boundary point on this land from memory, and I can prove through my own survey records that the property lines described in the original deed match this ground exactly and do not match the boundaries claimed in the fraudulent bill of sale." Another silence. She did not look up. "You are going to win," he said. "Yes," she agreed. She heard him exhale not quite a sigh, something shorter than that. She finished her measurement, made a notation on the sketch, and then stood and looked at him. In the lantern light, his expression was something she had not seen before on his face. It was open in a way that his daytime face was not, as if the dark had removed some of the careful architecture of it. "Hollis came to see you," he said. "It was not a question." "Yes." "What did he offer you?" $500 and a great deal of condescension," she said. "I declined both." Something flickered in his eyes. "I went to San Antonio last week," he said. "I paid a visit to Raymond Hollis's business partner, a man named Keach. It took some persuasion, but he told me things that—" He stopped, ran a hand along the back of his neck. "Miss Carver, I did not know the title was fraudulent when I bought this property. I want you to know that." Helen studied his face. "What you knew and did not know is relevant to how much sympathy I might feel for your situation," she said carefully. "It is not relevant to the legal question of who holds the rightful deed." "No," he said. "I know that. Why did you go to San Antonio?" He looked at her directly. "Because you told me Hollis had done this before in this county. And because if I am holding land I did not legally acquire, I want to know it." She was quiet for a moment. "What will you do if the court finds for me?" "Accept it," he said, without hesitation. "And then go back to San Antonio and recover my $4,000 from Raymond Hollis by whatever means are available to me." "The legal means, I hope," she said. "Predominantly," he said, and there it was the ghost of a smile again. On him it was a devastating thing, and she wished he would stop doing it. "Mr. Sheridan," she said, deciding that directness was, as it had always been, her best defense, "are you genuinely telling me that if this court rules in my favor, you intend to simply walk away from this property?" "Yes," he said, "even though you paid $4,000 for it." "I paid $4,000 for a legitimate deed," he said. "It appears I did not receive one. That is between me and Raymond Hollies, not between me and you." She looked at him for a long, measuring moment, in the way she looked at survey results when she was checking them against expected values. He held the examination without flinching, which she noted. "Then I will see you in court, Mr. Sheridan," she said. He touched the brim of his hat and turned back toward his horse. He had gone a few steps when she heard herself say, before she had fully decided to, "What did Keach tell you?" "In San Antonio," he paused, half-turned, "that Hollies has done this to 8 properties in 4 counties over the past 6 years. That he deliberately targets land belonging to women or widows or families without male heirs because he has found them easier to intimidate into accepting settlements. That he had identified your property as a target 2 years before your father died." He paused. "And that the fire at the county land office last year was not an accident." The lantern flickered between them in the night air. "I see," Helen said, very quietly. "I am sorry," he said, and then he mounted his horse and rode away. She stood in the yard for a time after he had gone, the lantern casting its small circle of light around her, the sketch of her property spread on the ground at her feet, and she thought about her father, who had apparently seen all of this coming and had done everything in his power to protect her even from beyond the grave. She also thought, with considerably more ambivalence, about David Sheridan. He was not what she had expected. He was not simple or corrupt or easy to dismiss. He was a man with a complicated history and a reputation that preceded him like weather, and he had been used as a tool by Raymond Hollies the same way the land itself had been used. She was not sure whether she believed his account of his own innocence entirely, because she had learned not to believe men entirely on their own authority, but she was inclined to believe most of it because of the way he had said it. Men who are performing innocence choose their words more carefully. David Sheridan had not performed. He had simply told her. She rolled up the sketch, picked up her lantern, and went inside. The morning of the hearing came clear and cold, with a hard blue March sky above the plains of Crockett County. Helen Carver, dressed in her best outfit, a dark green wool dress that had been her mother's, altered to fit her over the years, with a cream-colored collar and her father's good leather brooch at the throat, and she rode into Redemption with Ernesto Vidal beside her and the leather satchel across her saddle, and she was the calmest she had been in 6 weeks. Archibald Holt met her at the door of the Cattlemen's Union Hall, dressed in his best black coat with his hair combed with unusual precision. Behind him, already seated in the gallery, she saw Silas Webb and Clara Morrison. She saw half a dozen other familiar faces from the county people who had come to watch, some out of sympathy and some out of skepticism, and some because there was nothing more compelling in Crockett County in the spring of 1882 than a woman trying to take her land back from an outlaw. She also saw David Sheridan, already seated at the respondent's table with Gerald Finch beside him, and he looked up when she came through the door. Their eyes met across the length of the room, and she held the contact for exactly the 3 seconds it took her to reach her table, and then she sat down and focused on the documents in front of her. Judge Harlan Beaumont was a thin, precise man of 60 with a judge's face, one that had heard so many different stories from so many different people that it no longer reacted visibly to any of them. He came in from the back room, everyone rose, and then the proceedings began. Gerald Finch went first, presenting the respondent's case with the polished efficiency of a practiced attorney who was accustomed to winning through momentum and confidence. He laid out the chain of title clearly. The bill of sale from Carver to Hollies, the subsequent sale from Hollies to Sheridan, the notarized documents, the registration at the county office. He described Helen Carver's challenge as an understandable but legally unfounded claim from a distressed party who was responding emotionally rather than factually to a legitimate transaction. He did not say just a woman in so many words, but the architecture of his argument was built on the assumption that the court would view her that way, and Helen noticed it and filed it away. Then Judge Beaumont looked at her. "Miss Carver, you may present." She stood. She began with the death certificate. Thomas Edwin Carver, deceased December 2, 1878, recorded at the Crockett County Register of Deaths, signed by the attending physician and 2 witnesses. She presented a certified copy. She laid it on the judge's table. Then she presented the bill of sale from Holly's, the one that formed the basis of Sheridan's claim, dated November 14, 1879. She laid it beside the death certificate and let the 11 months between them speak for a moment before she said, "Your Honor, it is not possible for a man to sell property 11 months after his own death. This bill of sale is a forgery." Gerald Finch objected. Judge Beaumont sustained it on technical grounds, but noted the point for the record in a way that suggested he had already made a mental note of the same obvious fact. Then Helen took the deed from her satchel. She unfolded it and placed it before the judge, and said what she had said at the opening of this story, and watched David Sheridan come forward in his chair with an expression that she would remember for the rest of her life. That moment of complete and absolute astonishment when a man realizes he has badly underestimated the situation. "The original signed deed to the Carver Ranch," she said, keeping her voice steady, "registered in the Crockett County Land Office on March the 4th, 1871, bearing the signature of my father, Thomas Edwin Carver, the Crockett County clerk, and 2 witnesses who are still living and present in this room today." Judge Beaumont examined the document with great care. He called Silas Webb to the witness chair. He called Clara Morrison. Both of them confirmed their signatures without hesitation, described the circumstances of the original deed signing in consistent detail, and withstood Gerald Finch's cross-examination without a single significant inconsistency. Then Helen called Archibald Holt, who explained under oath how the 3rd copy of the deed had come to be in his possession, confirmed the chain of custody had been unbroken, and delivered his testimony with the precisely calibrated authority of a man who had spent 40 years on the right side of the legal profession. Then Helen presented her survey records. This was the part that the gallery did not entirely understand at first. They heard her describe the precise boundary measurements of the Carver Ranch as established in the 1871 deed, and then describe her own survey records spanning the past 12 years. And they watched her unroll the detailed drawings she had been working on by lantern light, the evening David Sheridan had come to watch her. And they heard her explain, in language that was clear enough for non-surveyors to follow, that the property described in the fraudulent bill of sale had boundary lines that differed from the legal deed at 3 critical points, meaning that whoever had forged it had worked from an inaccurate secondary description rather than the original plat. Judge Beaumont leaned forward at this point. He said, "Miss Carver, are you saying you can demonstrate the forgery through the property survey itself?" "Yes, Your Honor," she said. "A person working from the original deed would have the correct measurements. A person working from a rough description or a secondary source, as a forger would have, once the county copy was destroyed in the fire, would produce exactly the kind of discrepancies I am showing you here." The judge looked at the drawing for a long moment. Gerald Finch tried to object on the grounds that a lay person's survey testimony was inadmissible, and Archibald Holt, who had been sitting in the gallery with the technical status of an advisor, stood and said in a voice of magnificent calm that Helen Carver held a surveying certificate issued by the state of Texas in 1876, and had conducted over 30 surveys filed in Crockett and adjacent counties in the years since, and that her professional qualifications exceeded those of several men who had testified as expert witnesses in this same court. The objection was overruled. Helen finished her presentation and sat down. She placed her hands flat on the table in front of her and breathed slowly and evenly and waited. Gerald Finch had his rebuttal, which amounted to several procedural objections and one character argument that Judge Beaumont dispatched with a raised hand and a single word that was not quite polite but was entirely definitive. Then the judge ruled. He ruled clearly, completely, and without visible hesitation. The bill of sale underlying the respondent's title was fraudulent on its face, the forgery demonstrated by both documentary evidence and professional survey analysis. The original deed presented by the plaintiff was authentic, legally registered, and constituted the rightful title to the property. The Carver Ranch belonged to Helen Carver. The fraudulent transfer was void. He referred the matter of Raymond Hollies to the county sheriff for investigation, noted the additional criminal matter of the 1881 land office fire for referral to the appropriate authorities, and closed proceedings. The gallery erupted. Helen sat very still in the noise and commotion of it, with the deed in her hands, and felt the tension of the past 6 weeks unknot in her chest all at once, replaced by something warm and enormous that she was not going to cry about in a public room. She was aware, in the periphery of all of this, that David Sheridan had not moved from his chair. Gerald Finch was gathering papers and speaking to him in a low, urgent voice, but Sheridan was sitting quietly with his elbows on the table and his hands clasped, looking at the front of the room or at nothing in particular, and his expression was not anger. It was something more complicated. Archibald Holt was beside her then, shaking her hand with both of his and saying things she only half heard, and Silas Webb and Clara Morrison were pressing through the gallery crowd, and Ernesto Vidal was grinning at the back of the room with his hat over his chest, and it was wonderful and overwhelming, and she was deeply, entirely grateful for all of it. She made herself look across the room to where Sheridan sat. He was already looking at her. Something passed between them across the noise and the crowd, something wordless and significant. He gave her a nod, slow and deliberate, wholly genuine. She gave him one in return. Then someone else was speaking to her and she turned away. It was not until the crowd had thinned and she was outside in the afternoon light preparing to ride home that she heard his voice behind her. "Miss Carver," she turned. He was standing a few feet away on the boardwalk alone, his hat in his hands rather than on his head, which for some reason made him look different, more approachable and somehow larger at the same time. "Congratulations," he said. "You presented an exceptional case." "Thank you," she said. She studied him. He still had the look of a man recalibrating a world that had just rearranged itself, and she found she could not be entirely unsympathetic to it. "You were not bluffing," he said. "I never bluff," she replied. "I simply wait until I have enough facts to be certain before I make my position clear. I have never met a woman who surveyed land," he said. "I have never met anyone, man or woman, who proved a title forgery through a property survey. It is a logical method," she said, "given the evidence available. It is remarkable," he said. And this time there was no ambiguity in it, no hedging, no element of surprise that contradicted the compliment. He said it with the straightforward sincerity of a man who meant exactly what he was saying. "You are remarkable." Helen looked at him. The afternoon light was doing something unfair to the angles of his face, and she was becoming aware that the particular warmth she had been suppressing for several weeks was not going to stay suppressed indefinitely. "What will you do now?" she asked, to redirect the conversation to something safe. "Go back to San Antonio," he said. "Find Hollies. Recover my money through whatever legal and occasionally extra-legal means are available to me." He paused. "And then I am not entirely certain." "There is good land available in this county," she said, before she could stop herself. "Legally available land with clear titles, if you are looking for somewhere to settle." He looked at her, and the faintest edge of that smile appeared. "Is that an invitation, Miss Carver?" "It is geographical information," she said firmly, and turned back to her horse. She heard him laugh behind her, a real one this time, not the controlled, social version she had heard before, but something that came from actual amusement. She tightened her saddle cinch with more attention than was technically necessary and did not permit herself to smile until she was facing away from him. The days after the hearing settled into a new quiet that was different from the old one. The ranch was still hers. The rhythm of its work reasserted itself, the cattle, the fence lines, the seasonal turning of everything, and Helen moved through it with the particular peace of a person who has fought hard for something and won. She wrote letters. She continued her survey work, including 2 commissions from neighboring landowners who had heard about the court case, and decided that having their own property properly documented was a sound idea. She and Archibald Holt exchanged a long and warmly affectionate correspondence about the legal significance of survey evidence in title disputes, which they both found more enjoyable than most people would have found it. She did not see David Sheridan. She thought about him more than she wanted to, which was a problem she addressed by being busier than was entirely necessary. She thought about the way he had sat across a courtroom and watched her dismantle his claim without anger. She thought about the way he had come to watch her survey by lamplight and said nothing until she was ready to be spoken to. She thought about the way he had said the word remarkable without making it sound like a surprise. She put it firmly away because he was gone and she had work to do. 3 weeks after the hearing, Raymond Hollies was arrested in San Antonio and charged with fraud, forgery, and conspiracy. The charges related not only to the Carver Ranch, but to 6 other fraudulent land transfers in Crockett and adjacent counties, which was slightly fewer than the 8 David Sheridan had mentioned, but still quite enough. The news came in the form of a letter from the county sheriff's office, attached to a newspaper clipping from the San Antonio Express. Helen read the article twice, then pinned it to the board above her father's desk. 2 days after that, she was in the north pasture checking the fence line along the creek when she heard a horse on the track above the ridge. She did not immediately look up from the fence post she was examining because fence posts generally required attention. "I recovered my $4,000, said David Sheridan's voice above her. She straightened and turned around. He was on his black horse at the top of the ridge, looking down at her, and the afternoon light was doing the same unfair things it had been doing in Redemption. "Hollies," she said. "His attorney, technically, once the charges were filed. Turns out the threat of criminal prosecution makes men significantly more willing to return money they probably should not have accepted in the first place." "That is generally my experience as well," she agreed. He rode down off the ridge and dismounted at the fence line. He was wearing a different coat than the one she had seen him in before, heavier, well-made, a dark wool that had not been bought in any frontier town. He looked, she thought irrelevantly, like someone who had just completed a piece of significant business and was considering what came next. "You mentioned there was land available in this county," he said. She looked at him. "I did. Legally available land, clear titles. There is a 400-acre parcel on the eastern side of the county, bordering the Salado Creek. The Hendricks family sold it last year, and the new owner has not developed it. Good grazing land, reliable water access." He nodded slowly, looking out across her pasture. "And is there work here? Survey work? I imagine after the Holly situation, people in this county are considerably more interested in having their land properly documented." "There is," she said carefully, "although I manage my own surveying." "I know," he said. "I was not suggesting otherwise. I was asking whether the county in general offers enough opportunity to justify settling here." She looked at him for a long moment. A crow called from the cottonwood trees along the creek. The spring air moved through the grass with a sound like quiet breathing. "Why are you here, Mr. Sheridan?" she asked. Not unkindly, directly, the way she always was. He met her eyes. "Because I have not been able to stop thinking about you since the hearing," he said. "And I have ridden enough miles in my life to know that I should pay attention when that happens, because it does not happen often, and I am not a man who is typically inclined to pursue things that do not come naturally. But this is—" He stopped, looked at the fence post she had been examining, then back at her. You are the most intelligent person I have encountered in a very long time, possibly ever. You are also the only person who has ever defeated me in any contest of any kind without my being angry about it afterward. In fact, he paused again, and she could see him choosing the honest word over the comfortable one. Impressed. I was genuinely, completely impressed, and I would like very much to know you better if that is something you would be willing to consider. Helen Carver stood in her north pasture with her fence-checking tools in her hand and the spring wind moving through the grass around her, and looked at David Sheridan, and told herself the entirely rational thing to do was to say something measured and appropriate and send him on his way until she had had sufficient time to think clearly about this. What she actually said was, "There is coffee at the house. If you would like to continue this conversation somewhere less exposed to weather." The smile that crossed his face at that was not the ghost of one or the echo of one. It was the whole thing, unguarded and genuine, and it did things to the careful architecture of her practical mind that she decided she would deal with later. They walked back toward the house, his horse trailing behind, and talked about the Hendricks parcel and the water rights along the Salado Creek and the prevailing land values in Crockett County. And it was one of the most comfortable conversations Helen had had in years, which was either a very good sign or a very dangerous one, and she was increasingly uncertain which. David Sheridan had coffee at her kitchen table. Then he stayed for supper, because Ernesto had made an abundant amount of black beans and cornbread, and it would have been wasteful not to offer. And they talked about survey techniques and property law and the cattle market, and the particular challenges of managing land alone and the nature of reputation, and how a man accumulates one and whether it can be rebuilt differently. And it was the kind of conversation that moves easily between subjects without losing its essential thread, because the thread is not the topic but the two people who are talking. He had been, she learned, the son of a ranching family in New Mexico territory that had lost everything to drought and bad debt when he was 17. He had worked his way through the territories doing whatever work was available: cattle drives, freight hauling, a brief and apparently undistinguished attempt at gold mining, and had accumulated his outlaw reputation through a series of events that were complicated enough that she did not form a simple judgment about them, which she appreciated as an experience, because simple judgments bored her. He had never been a man who hurt innocent people. He had been, at various points, a man who operated outside the law on behalf of people who had no other recourse, which was a different thing, and the distinction mattered to her. She told him about her mother, who had died when Helen was 12, and about learning survey work alongside her father in the years after, traveling with him across the territories with the transit level and the chain and the field books. She told him about the particular satisfaction of measuring a piece of ground and knowing, with mathematical certainty, exactly where it began and ended and what it contained. She told him it had always seemed to her that there was a kind of justice in accurate measurement, that the land did not lie, and neither did the numbers, and in a world where both people and documents could be forged, that reliability was worth something. He listened with the focused attention of a man who is genuinely interested in what the other person is saying, and she found this more attractive than almost anything else about him. When he left, it was late enough that the stars were fully visible over the plains. He mounted his horse at the gate, and she stood on the porch steps. "The Hendricks parcel," he said. "Would you be willing to survey it if I were to pursue purchasing it?" "That would be a conflict of interest," she said. "I would recommend Archibald Holt's former apprentice, a young man named Garrett who set up practice in Redemption 2 years ago. He is competent and honest. But if I had questions about the survey results, I could bring them to you." She looked up at him against the stars. "You could bring them to me," she said. He touched his hat brim and rode into the dark, and Helen went inside and sat in her father's chair and acknowledged, very quietly and without drama, that she was in serious trouble of the best possible kind. Over the following weeks, David Sheridan bought the Hendricks parcel. He had it surveyed by young Garrett, whose results he brought to Helen for review, as he had said he might. She found one minor error in the creek boundary measurement, which she corrected with a brief and completely professional explanation, and he listened with the same focused attention she was becoming accustomed to, and asked 3 intelligent questions that demonstrated he understood what she was telling him, and thanked her. He began developing the parcel. He hired men, which created some work for the local economy and some interest in the local gossip, which in Crockett County was a form of entertainment that operated continuously and without apparent need of sleep. The word was that David Sheridan, the broken spur outlaw, had settled in Crockett County and was running cattle. The word was also, and this part was delivered with considerably more animation, that he was calling on Helen Carver with a regularity that indicated intentions. He was calling on Helen Carver with a regularity that indicated intentions. He rode over on Sunday afternoons, and they sat on the porch with coffee and discussed things. He came by on Wednesday evenings after his workday was done, sometimes with a question about property measurements, and sometimes without any pretense of one. He brought her a book he had found in a shop in Redemption, a collected edition of scientific essays on land formation and topography that he said had made him think of her, and she received it with a warmth she did not entirely suppress. In May, there was a town dance at the Redemption Grange Hall, the kind of event that the entire county attended, because there was nothing else to do on a Saturday night within 12 miles in any direction, and David Sheridan arrived, and he found Helen Carver before she had been there 5 minutes, and he asked her to dance. She had not danced with anyone in years. She had attended enough of these events to know that she was considered a woman who made men slightly nervous, too sharp, too capable, too self-sufficient, and she had stopped minding it because she had learned that the company of books and her own work was genuinely enjoyable. But she had also never stopped missing the particular pleasure of dancing, which required a partner and was therefore entirely outside the domain of self-sufficiency. She said yes. He danced the way he did everything else, unhurried and certain and completely present. He was a good dancer, which she had not expected, though she was not sure why not. She was a good dancer, which he seemed to discover with the same expression of pleased discovery that he had apparently appointed as his reaction to each new thing he learned about her. "You are full of surprises," he said, as they moved through the second figure of the reel. "I am entirely consistent," she replied. "You are simply discovering the content." He laughed, and she felt it through the hand he had at her back, and it was one of the most pleasant sensory experiences she had had in some time. After the dancing, there was a walk in the warm May evening, and they talked about his cattle and her current survey commissions, and the general question of what Crockett County might look like in 20 years. And at some point during this conversation, they were walking close enough that their hands brushed. And then they were walking with her hand tucked into the bend of his arm, which had happened so naturally she was not entirely certain how. "Helen," he said, which was the first time he had used her given name, and she noticed it. "Yes," she said. "I am not a simple man," he said. "I have a complicated history and a reputation that I am aware does not recommend me to respectable society. I am not going to pretend otherwise. I did not fall in love with my father's ranch because it had an easy history," she said, and then stopped herself, because that sentence had gone somewhere she had not entirely intended. He stopped walking. She stopped walking. They stood on the edge of the Redemption Grange yard in the warm May night, with the music drifting from the hall behind them and the stars laid out over the plains in every direction, and he looked at her with an expression that was more unguarded than any she had yet seen from him. "Did you just say what I think you said?" he asked. She took a measured breath. "I was making an analogy," she said, "about complicated things being worth the engagement." "Helen," he said quietly. She looked at him. "I am falling in love with you," he said. I have been for some time. I wanted to say that plainly because you are a person who respects plain speaking, and because it is the most honest thing I can tell you, and I think you deserve honesty above most other things." She looked up at his face in the starlight and thought about honesty, which she did indeed value above most things, and about the way he had said it, not as a performance, not as a rhetorical gambit, but with the same directness he brought to everything else. The directness she had thought at the beginning was arrogance, and had gradually understood was just the way he was. "I am falling in love with you as well," she said, "against my considerably better judgment and with full awareness that it complicates my life." "Does it?" he said. "Complicate it?" "Yes," she said, "because I am not willing to stop being who I am or doing what I do." "I know," he said. And then, because he was a man who knew when a direct answer was the only acceptable one, he said, "I would not want you to. I fell in love with who you are, Helen, not with who I imagine I might prefer you to be. Those are different things." She was quiet for a moment, looking at him. Then she said, "I believe that is the most intelligent thing you have said since I met you." He smiled slowly in a way that reached every part of his face. "High praise from you." "It is," she agreed, and then he took both of her hands in both of his and she let him, and it was warm and steady and remarkably right. The summer of 1882 was one of the best Helen Carver could remember. The ranch thrived. Her survey commissions increased. Raymond Hollies was convicted on 6 counts of land fraud and sentenced to 7 years in the Huntsville State Penitentiary, and she felt a satisfaction in this that was not quite vengeful but was deeply complete. The 2 county officials who had been complicit in filing the fraudulent transfers were removed from their positions and formally censured, and the county land office underwent a significant reorganization that included considerably more rigorous authentication procedures. Archibald Holt, who had helped design those procedures, wrote to her that he considered it the most satisfying outcome of his legal career, and she wrote back that he was welcome to claim full credit since he was 81 and deserved the satisfaction. David Sheridan's ranch was coming together with the same methodical thoroughness he brought to everything. He had a good eye for cattle and an excellent one for the land, and his neighbors, who had initially regarded him with the caution due a man of his reputation, were beginning to revise their assessments in the direction of grudging respect, and then just respect, because he was honest and he worked hard and he dealt fairly with everyone. He proposed to Helen in September, on the porch of her house in the late afternoon light, with a directness that was very like him and a nervousness that was very unlike him, and that she found endearing in a way she would have denied vigorously if pressed. He said, "Helen, I want to marry you. I want to build something with you on this land that I think we could build better together than either of us could alone. I'm not asking you to give up anything. I'm asking you to add me to everything you already have, and I will do everything in my power to be worth that." She looked at him for a moment, the particular look that she brought to survey results and legal documents and other things that required careful evaluation, and then she said yes. The wedding was in October, in the small church in Redemption, with Archibald Holt as legal witness and Ernesto Vidal in his best hat, and Clara Morrison and Silas Webb in the front pews. It was not a large affair, but it was warm and genuine and attended by most of the county regardless, because the most compelling narrative in Crockett County in 1882 was the woman who had beaten an outlaw in court and then married him, and no one in the county was going to miss the ending of that story. The minister spoke about the difficulty of building things that last, and about the particular grace of 2 people who choose each other with full knowledge of who the other person is. Helen thought during this about the deed in her satchel and the deed on the wall of her father's desk, and the deed that David had received for his parcel on the eastern side of the county, and how all of it, the land and the law and the careful, methodical work of proving what was true, had led to this particular moment in this particular church. She had always believed that precision mattered, that the accurate measurement of things was a form of justice. The numbers did not lie, and neither did the ground. And if you were patient enough and skilled enough to take the measurements correctly, you would eventually see the truth of whatever you were looking at. She looked at David Sheridan standing beside her, and she thought that this too was a kind of surveying, and the measurements were precise. They moved into the Carver Ranch house together after the wedding, because it was the larger and more established property, and David hired an additional hand to help Ernesto with the increased cattle operation. He kept his Hendricks parcel running with a foreman named Billy Reyes who had come up from the south and turned out to be excellent with cattle and even better with difficult terrain. The winter of 1882 was cold and quiet and entirely satisfying. They had evenings by the fire and long conversations that moved from practical ranch business to legal theory to the historical survey methods of the Spanish colonial period in Texas, which was a topic Helen had been reading about and which David found genuinely interesting, not performatively so. He read the books she recommended and came back with questions that demonstrated he had actually read them, which she appreciated more than most husbands would have guessed. He learned to assist her with survey work. Not at the professional level. He had neither the training nor the years, but in the practical role of a capable field partner who could hold the far end of the chain and call back measurements accurately and recognize when something did not look right, which was more than most people could manage. She found she liked having him with her in the field, not just for the company, though the company was excellent, but because he saw things she sometimes missed. He had good spatial instincts, a quality she associated with people who had spent years moving through unfamiliar territory and had learned to read landscape well. "You should take a formal course in surveying," she told him one February afternoon as they were finishing a boundary survey of a neighboring family's creekfront property. He looked at her from behind the transit level. "Are you offering to teach me?" "I am suggesting it as a professional development," she said, and then she smiled because she could not help it. "But yes, I could teach you." "Then yes," he said without any hesitation, and she did. Over the following year, she taught him the methodical, mathematical world of land measurement with the same patience and precision her father had used with her, and he learned it with the focused attention that was one of his most reliable qualities. He was not a surveyor by the end of it, that would take years more, but he was a competent field partner, and he understood the theory well enough to evaluate the results of other surveyors' work with an informed eye. This turned out to be practically useful, because the county was growing and more survey work was being commissioned, and having a partner who could handle certain aspects of the field work allowed Helen to take on significantly more commissions. By the spring of 1883, they had established something that functioned as a small but respected survey and land management office out of the Carver Ranch, serving landowners across Crockett County and occasionally beyond. It was not a formal business in the way that word would be understood later, but it was a recognized practice, and Helen Carver Sheridan was known as the most reliable land surveyor in the region, which she found satisfying in a deep and thorough way. In the summer of 1883, she discovered she was expecting a child. She told David on a Tuesday evening in June, sitting at the kitchen table after supper with the account spread in front of her, in the same matter-of-fact tone she used for other significant information. He was quiet for a moment that stretched long enough that she looked up from the accounts. He was looking at her with an expression that undid something in the region of her chest, open and unguarded and full of something she did not have a precise word for, though she had read enough of it in the past year to recognize it. "Are you certain?" he asked. "I am precise by training and careful by inclination," she said. "Yes, I am certain." He stood up, came around the table, and gathered her into his arms in a way that was comprehensive and warm, and exactly what she had not known she needed until it was happening. She let herself be held for a moment, her face against his collar, and felt the steady beat of him and the warmth of the Texas evening and the particular safety of a person who loves you knowing the full facts of who you are. "Are you frightened?" he asked quietly into her hair. "I am not generally frightened by facts," she said. "I am occasionally daunted by the practical implications of them." He pressed his lips to the top of her head. "I will be here for every practical implication," he said. All of them without exception. She believed him, which was the best thing about it. Their son was born in February of 1884, in the middle of a cold night that stretched long and difficult, with a doctor from Redemption and Ernesto Vidal awake in the kitchen and David sitting beside her throughout in the steadfast, quiet way that was most essentially him. They named him Thomas Edwin Sheridan for her father, and when Helen held him for the first time she thought about the man who had loved her enough to leave her a deed in a retired judge's strongbox, and she was very glad and very grateful. David held his son with the careful, slightly overwhelmed tenderness of a large man handling something new and precious, and said very quietly, "He is remarkable." Helen looked at him. "That is a word you use when you are impressed," she said. He looked up at her, and the warmth in his face was something she would remember clearly for the rest of her life. "I am consistently impressed," he said. "It is becoming a defining feature of my existence." Thomas was a good baby, quiet and watchful, with his father's gray eyes and his mother's habit of observing everything carefully before committing to a response. He went with his mother into the field from the time he was old enough to be carried in the fashion of the day, tucked against her on the survey routes, and grew up understanding that work and love were not separate things but aspects of the same life. Redemption grew in the years that followed. The railroad came to a town 12 miles north in 1886, and the effects rippled through the county in the way that railroads always affected frontier communities, opportunity and disruption in roughly equal measure, and people arguing about which predominated at every social gathering for the next several years. Helen's survey work increased significantly as land values shifted and property disputes multiplied in proportion to the growing population. She was appointed as an official county surveyor in 1887, the first woman to hold that position in Crockett County, and as far as anyone could establish, in any Texas county to that point. It was noted in the San Antonio Express. Archibald Holt, who was 86 by then, and had deteriorated to a point where he was reading with a magnifying glass, but had not in any meaningful way diminished, wrote her a letter of such warm and precise congratulation that she read it 3 times, and then folded it into the box where she kept her father's letters. David's ranch continued to grow. He merged the Hendricks parcel with a smaller adjacent property he purchased in 1885, making his operation one of the 5 largest in the county, and he ran it with the same clear-eyed directness he brought to everything. His reputation in the county had completed its transformation from cautious toleration to genuine respect. He was a man people trusted, which he valued in a way that was personal and specific, having spent enough years as a man people categorically did not trust to understand the difference it made. They had a second child in 1887, a girl they named Margaret Clara, for Clara Morrison, who had testified for them at the hearing and had become a dear family friend. Margaret arrived with considerably more efficiency than Thomas had, and with a set of opinions about her immediate environment that she expressed loudly and without ambiguity from the first hour, which both her parents found extremely appropriate. The house expanded over the years. A new wing on the east side in 1886, properly measured and framed by men whose work David supervised, and whose measurements Helen verified, because some habits were not merely professional. A study for Helen, with shelves along 3 walls for the books and survey instruments and field notebooks that had accumulated over the years. A room for Thomas's growing collection of rocks and natural specimens, which he arranged with a methodical precision that made his mother feel a specific and tender kind of pride. In 1889, Archibald Holt died peacefully in his sleep, at the age of 88, having accomplished, by his own accounting, everything he had set out to accomplish, and several things he had not expected. He left Helen his entire professional library, 4 trunks of legal texts and treatises, and a letter that said, in part, that she was the finest legal mind he had encountered in a lifetime of knowing a great many of them, and that the territory was better for her presence in it. David read the letter and agreed with every word of it, which Helen received in the silence of her study and allowed herself to feel fully. That autumn, the family rode out to the boundary of the Carver ranch on a clear October morning. Helen and David, and 5-year-old Thomas and 2-year-old Margaret, who was on her father's horse in front of him with her hands wrapped around the saddle horn, in a posture of magnificent confidence. And they stood at the northeast corner post, where the original survey marker had been set in 1871. Helen had replaced the marker 2 years prior, setting it precisely, mathematically perfectly in exactly the right position, and inscribed on it the date of the original deed and the date of her survey. She ran her fingers over the inscription. Thomas, who was at the age of intense and systematic questions, said, "Mama, why does it have 2 dates?" "Because the first date is when your grandfather measured this place," Helen said, "and the second date is when I measured it again, to make sure it was still right." "And was it?" Thomas asked. "It was exactly right," she said. David put his arm around her, there at the boundary marker of the land that her father had built and she had defended, and they were building together, and she leaned into him in the way she had learned to do, not because she needed the support, but because she wanted it, which was different and better. Thomas was examining the corner marker with the focused attention of a child who will probably someday want to understand how things are measured. Margaret had extracted herself from the saddle by a method that defied easy description, and was currently marching through the grass with the confidence of someone who owns the ground she is walking on. Helen watched her daughter and thought that this was the most accurate measurement she had ever taken. This life, this morning, this family on this particular piece of ground, and that the numbers were, as they had always been when she was careful and patient and precise, exactly right. David's lips were warm against her temple, and the October plains stretched out around them in every direction, and the boundary marker stood where it should stand, where it had always stood, at the edge of the land that was hers and theirs and the beginning of everything else. She had never bluffed, not once in her life. She had simply waited until she had enough facts to be certain, and then she had stated them plainly. And the rest, the love, the family, the life that was wider and warmer and more precisely right than she could have calculated on the best survey she ever completed, the rest had followed, as truth tends to do when given sufficient room.